Chapter 10, Part 2 of Women of the French Revolution by Winifred Stevens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2 of the Rise and Fall of the Women's Party. Robespierre had traveled far since the day when at Arras he had charmed Mademoiselle de Keralio by desiring that men and women should work in double harness. Robespierre had now become as inveterate an anti-feminist as his master Rousseau. Collot d'Herbois raised the laugh against Théroigne when in her presence at the Jacobin Club, with mock regret, he said he had heard Théroigne declaring that she must withdraw her friendship from him and from Robespierre. Théroigne, infuriated, leapt from her seat onto the platform and clamoured to be allowed to speak. Such an uproar followed that the President put on his hat, thus signifying the adjournment of the meeting. Théroigne was at this time living close to the Jacobins at 273 Rue Saint-Honoré, where she held a salon and whence she continued to carry on her feminist propaganda. Like Olympe, she had her manifestos posted on the hoardings. One of these exists today in the Bibliothèque Nationale. Printed on grey paper, it is an appeal to the 48 sections of Paris, each to nominate from among the worthiest and the most highly respected women of the section 6 whose duty it should be to remind the citizens of the dangers threatening the country, of the necessity of maintaining order and liberty of opinion. These reminders were indeed becoming more and more necessary every day, and none had more need of them than Théroigne. But she herself was soon to fall a victim of that anarchy against which she was protesting. In the quarrel between the Jacobins and the Girondins, which reached its climax in the May of this year, 1793, the former had not hesitated to employ against their political enemies les tricoteuses, les poissardes, and the lowest women of the streets. The most disreputable of these women roughs, said to be in the pay of the Jacobins, used to surge in angry mobs on the Feuillants terrace and round the doors of the Assembly. There they refused to allow any to enter who were not of their own particular brand of political opinion. It had long been the custom of these fearsome Maenads publicly to flog in the most humiliating manner any of their number whose views or conduct displeased them. The prints of the period represent many such scenes which even our Gilray might hesitate to depict. Théroigne had protested against these indecent floggings, and had threatened to make the whippers lick the dust. They took their revenge. On the 15th of May, when at 9 o'clock in the morning Théroigne was crossing the Feuillants terrace on her way to the Assembly, the women set upon her and fustigated her with such vigor that she might have died had not the guard rescued her from their hands. According to one account, Marat was her deliverer; for Marat, as we have seen, was something of a feminist. This was Théroigne's last appearance in public. She did not immediately lose her reason, as some have maintained, for there is evidence that she was managing her business affairs with perfect lucidity in the following summer. A year later she was incapable of doing so, and a family council was convened to nominate a guardian who should act for her. By that time Théroigne had been arrested by the Revolutionary Committee of her section, on what charge does not appear, but probably for some imprudent words uttered by her in a fit of madness. A prey to one of the most ghastly forms of lunacy, she was transferred from prison to an asylum, and thence from madhouse to madhouse, during the 23 years of misery that remained to her; for she never recovered her reason. Finally, on the 1st of May, 1817, her tragic existence closed in the Salpêtrière hospital. Théroigne's humiliation in May and Olympe's arrest in July, 1793, left Claire Lacombe the leader of the Woman's Party. We have already seen her as the moving spirit of the Woman's Republican Revolutionary Club. Her feminism was of a different kind from that of Olympe and Théroigne. While they strove for nothing more than women's admission on the same terms as men to citizenship in the bourgeois republic, Lacombe aimed at something much wider. While their motto was le suffrage intégral, hers might have been l'humanité intégrale. For Lacombe and her brilliant young lover, Thésée Leclerc, belonged to the most extreme of revolutionary factions, les Enragés, with its headquarters in the club of that name. Though the word socialist had not yet been invented, les Enragés were the socialists of the Great Revolution, the ancestors of the Communards of 1871. Lacombe, or one of her women disciples, summed up their programme in a petition to the Convention, which said: "We desire that there should not be a single unfortunate person in the whole Republic." But before arriving at that blissful condition, les enragés were prepared to justify their title by rendering multitudes unfortunate. As sworn foes of the Jacobins, les enragés were prepared to oppose them on any ground, even on that of modérantisme; but generally les enragés, as extreme terrorists of the Terror, protested against what they called the indulgence of the Convention Leclerc, who had spent some time at Lyons before coming to Paris, had there proposed that 6,000 aristocrats should be cast into the Saône. Lacombe never followed her lover to such lengths. The accusation that she took part in the prison massacres of September, 1792, is without foundation. Indeed, one of the charges brought against her at her arrest 2 years later was that in the Republican Revolutionary Club she had protested against these massacres. Nevertheless, she and her club threw themselves on to the side of les enragés in their attack on the Jacobins and the Convention. Their plan was to demand the immediate execution of the Constitution which the Convention had drawn up, but which it refused to put into action until, so it said, the war was ended. On the 26th of August, 1793, Lacombe appeared before the Convention, at the head of a deputation from the Republican Revolutionary Club. She demanded the execution of the laws of the Constitution. "We have not," she remonstrated, "been the first to accept this Constitution in order that anarchy and the rule of intriguers may be indefinitely prolonged. We call upon you, by dismissing all nobles, to show that their defenders are not among you. It is not enough to tell the people that their happiness is near, you must make them experience it; and 4 years' unhappiness have rendered them chary of believing your fine promises. With what indignation must the people behold men gorged with their money and fattened on their blood preaching to them patience and sobriety? Would you have us believe that the country's enemies have no devoted defenders among you? Then dismiss all nobles without exception. If there be any of good faith, they will prove it by sacrificing themselves willingly for the country's welfare. Be not afraid of disorganizing the army. If a general's politics are bad, then the more talented he is, the more necessary is it to get rid of him. Do not be so unjust toward patriots as to believe that there is no one among them worthy to command our armies. If, when despotism reigned, crime was rewarded, under liberty's rule virtue should be given the preference. You have decreed that all suspected persons shall be arrested. Is not such a law grotesque, when those who execute it are themselves suspected? Ah, legislators! Is this how you trick the people? Is this the equality on which their happiness was to be founded? Is this their reward for the incalculable evils they have suffered so long and so patiently? No, it shall not be said that these people reduced to despair must take justice into their own hands. You will execute justice by dismissing guilty administrators, by creating extraordinary tribunals in such numbers that our patriots when they start for the front may be able to say, "We are not anxious about the fate of our women and children, for beneath the arm of the law we have seen all the plotters of the interior perish." Decree these great measures, and a mass levy of all the male population, and you will have saved la patrie. The Convention listened to Lacombe's speech in cold silence, and, as soon as it was finished, without note or comment, proceeded to the next business. The deputation had indeed experienced great difficulty in gaining admission. Another, which arrived after it, had been given the precedence; and against this injustice the young Leclerc, whose influence is plainly discernible in the petition itself, did not fail to protest. Not all the measures proposed by les enragés were as vindictive as these proposals of Lacombe. They advocated, for example, the institution of national workshops, somewhat on the lines of those which were to prove a failure in the Revolution of 1848. Olympe, by the way, with her habitual inconsistency, had supported this social reform, though she was anything but a Socialist. Girondins and Jacobins alike mistrusted les enragés. But the Jacobins in their conflict with their political enemies were glad to make use of these extremists. It is probable that with several other Republican Revolutionary women, Lacombe was present at the Jacobin meetings of March, April, and May, when the ruin of the Girondist party was decided on. When the Jacobins were finally victorious, and the Girondist leaders either executed or driven to wander homeless throughout France, then the victors turned against their former allies. And in this second faction fight, as we shall see, Lacombe and the woman's party she represented finally came to grief. How far the hooligan women who in the spring of 1793 were constituted, or constituted themselves, the doorkeepers of the Convention, were recruited by or even drawn from Lacombe's revolutionary Republican women has been much discussed. Girondist writers maintain that these frenzied Maenads were members of the club, and that it consisted of prostitutes and les plus idieuses coquines of Paris. But the Girondins were not impartial critics of the club, for it had been the most formidable of their political enemies. The Girondist accusation is not borne out by certain clauses in the club's constitution. The Republican Revolutionary Citizenesses, begins one of these, are convinced that without morals and principles liberty cannot exist. The Society has resolved, runs another, that it will only admit citizenesses of good morals. This it considers to be the most essential of all qualifications, and it has resolved that any failure to comply with this condition shall constitute one of the principal causes of exclusion. If the club consisted of prostitutes, it was strange that on the 21st of September, 1793, it should have sent a deputation to petition the Convention to transfer "women of bad life" (femmes de mauvaise vie) to houses instituted by the nation where they might be occupied in useful work, and by means of patriotic reading induced to forsake their evil ways; for, urged the petitioners, these unhappy victims of libertinage often have good hearts, and it is poverty alone that has frequently reduced them to this deplorable condition. As for the Jacobins, now that their Girondist enemies were disposed of, and they no longer needed the support either of the women roughs or of the women's club, they began to find both of them a nuisance, and in order to get rid of them were glad of the excuse of confounding the two with which their enemies had provided them. In this association of the women's party with les Enragés, the Jacobins found a further excuse for the anti-feminist campaign they now began to carry on in the Convention, the Commune, the Jacobin Club, the Jacobin Fraternal Society, and even in the Republican Revolutionary Club itself. This internecine campaign opened when, on the 31st of May, 1793, the Convention excluded women from its galleries. On that very day the women's party had received another rebuff. A deputation of women from the Republican Revolutionary Club to the Council General of the Commune had vainly petitioned that women should be allowed to join in the deliberations of the Revolutionary Committee of their own section. When 3 days later the same deputation approached the Convention, they were denied admittance. On the 31st of July, the Women's Club was significantly left out of the project to erect an obelisk in honor of Marat, and this in spite of the fact, to which Lacombe publicly drew attention, that with the women the idea had originated. Meanwhile Lacombe was having trouble with her own club, for some of its members refused to be identified with the ultra-violent party. One of these who had spoken at the Cordeliers Club was accused by one of the Cordeliers of being too indulgent. In August, Lacombe found it necessary to reproach certain of her followers with their devotion to Robespierre. "You are infatuated with Robespierre," she cried. "I regard him as an ordinary individual." In the Jacobin Club she was accused of having shown disrespect to Robespierre by calling him Monsieur Robespierre. In September, having in her turn become president of the Republican Revolutionary Club, Lacombe began a regular canvassing of the members of Le Comité de Sûreté Générale, with the object of obtaining their permission for the members of the club to visit the prisons, to interrogate the prisoners, and to set at liberty those whom they found innocent. Here les Enragés were substituting modérantisme for terrorisme. 2 members of the committee, Chabot and Basire, reported this extraordinary proceeding to the Jacobin Club. While roundly inveighing against Lacombe's action, they tried to explain it by saying that she had confessed to one of them her love for one of the prisoners, a Royalist, M. Doré, son of a former mayor of Toulouse. The wrath of the Jacobins, already waxing hot against Lacombe, rose to fever heat at this further accusation. The charge was probably groundless, for the object of this prison visitation was doubtless to set free some of the supporters of les Enragés. Nevertheless, the club was only too ready to believe Basire and Chabot's story. One member attributed to women the anarchical condition of the city. Protests from the women's gallery. But he continued and demanded Lacombe's arrest. Another citizen, Taschereau, with great probability accused Lacombe of pushing herself in everywhere, Citoyenne Lacombe se fourre partout. At a meeting at which the Speaker was present, he had heard her clamoring for the Constitution and nothing but the Constitution. What hypocritical and feuilleté (moderate) language, when she is trying to sap the foundation of the Constitution and to overthrow all constituted authorities. Another citizen: "The woman you denounce is very dangerous because she is very eloquent." At this moment Lacombe herself enters one of the galleries and seems to ask to speak. The noise and confusion are terrific. The President puts on his hat. When finally order is restored, the President, after rebuking Lacombe, puts two motions to the vote. First, that the Republican Revolutionary Club be asked to expel its suspected leaders. Second, that le Comité de Sûreté Générale be asked to arrest such suspected persons. Both resolutions were passed unanimously. Then an amendment was proposed that Lacombe be taken at once before le Comité de Sûreté Générale. Thereupon a citizen objected that this could not be done, that the Comité could only be asked to summon Lacombe before it. "I do not doubt," added the Speaker, "that she is an instrument of the counter revolution." Lacombe was not arrested, and on La Gazette Française announcing her arrest, she wrote to the editor, saying: "I will prove to you that my arms are as free as my body, for they will give themselves the treat of giving you a good whipping, if in your issue of to morrow you do not eat your words, and I keep my word. Femme Lacombe, Présidente." Though for the time being the President went free, the debate at the Jacobins had destroyed any prestige that remained to the Republican Revolutionary Club. On the 6th of October, a memorable anniversary, a deputation from a club known as La Société du 10 Août petitioned the Convention to dissolve the Women's Club. Strange to say, and most unfortunately for the club's reputation, the Convention refused. But before the month was out, the conduct of the women themselves put a second refusal out of the question. On the 28th of October, 1793, came the final struggle which decided the fate of the Women's Party. Were its causes less well known, one might have suspected the government of inciting an anti-feminist pogrom in order once and for all to banish women from French politics. As far as I know, however, no reliable authority has suggested that a hidden hand was behind the ostensible events that led to the disturbance. In the beginning the fault undoubtedly lay with the market women, les poissardes. And here, in this last act of the Revolution feminist drama, as in the first, the bread and cheese question constitutes the determining factor. For though the scarcity of food, the high prices, and the consequent scarcity of customers, les poissardes were turning against the Republic, and having torn off their tricolor cockades were reverting to Royalism. In September the Convention had made the wearing of the tricolor compulsory, and the Republican Revolutionary women took it upon themselves to exact obedience to the decree. We have already told how they dealt with the recalcitrants, how donning the red cap and masculine trousers, les clubistes paraded the streets, forcing the Royalist women to resume their cockades, and even to put on the red cap. As was inevitable, les poissardes refused in their own special way. There were the usual floggings, and Lacombe herself is said to have shared Théroigne's humiliation. Meanwhile, a horde of poissardes had invaded the Saint Eustache charnel house, where the Republican Revolutionary women were in session. There occurred scenes of such disorder as to provoke the intervention of a male armed force, la force armée. Not a large one, however, only 6 citizens with swords drawn and accompanied by a justice of the peace. The justice contented himself with demanding from the platform silence in the name of the law; and then, after assuring the invaders of the club that they would not again be asked to put on the red cap, but that they were at liberty to wear any head dress that pleased them, he withdrew, followed by his swordsmen, all very glad, no doubt, to get out of the medley. But the club women were disappointed with this mild intervention, and 3 times asked for it to be repeated. The armed men did not return; but unhappily for the club, as it turned out, the justice of the peace, only too courageous, did put in a second appearance. Reascending the platform, he suggested as the best way to restore order, that the vice president, who was in the chair, should take off her red cap. She did so, and put it on the head of the justice of the peace. Loud applause from the galleries. Then the justice apparently took his revenge. He declared the meeting closed. Les citoyennes révolutionnaires ne sont plus en séance, he cried. Anyone may come in. And they did. Immediately the rabble surged into the charnel house, and it seemed as if the gruesome place was about to deserve its name only too well. Had it not been for the intervention of a company of artillerymen, there would doubtless have been slaughter of women by women. As it was, many of the club members were seriously wounded. Surgeons were called in. The soldiers succeeded in providing a way of escape for the attacked, who at first repeatedly refused to avail themselves of it. All they desired was to have a record (procès-verbal) made of what had occurred. In the end they yielded to persuasion, and the charnel house was cleared. Thus ended what proved to be the last meeting of the Club of Republican Revolutionary Women. On the following day, the 29th of October, a deputation of women from one of the fraternal societies, la Société Populaire de la Section du Bon Conseil, appeared before the Convention and complained of the disorderly conduct of les citoyennes républicaines révolutionnaires. Thereupon the Convention, on the motion of Fabre d'Églantine, requested le Comité de Sûreté Générale to report on the question of women's clubs. The committee lost no time in sending its report. Hamar read it to the Convention the very next day. The measure it proposed, the suppression of all women's clubs and societies, was of course a foregone conclusion. But the arguments it adduced struck much deeper than the question than before the Convention of the continuance of women's clubs in France. They reached down to the fundamental principles of relations between the sexes. They were a prelude to the laws which, from that day to this, have determined those relations throughout the country. It was from this broad standpoint that Hamar approached the problem. Are women capable of exercising political rights, he inquired, and of taking an active part in the affairs of government? When assembled in political associations, are they capable of deliberating? The committee, said Hamar, had examined the two questions and had replied in the negative to both. Woman's nature is such, he argued, as to unfit her to take part in politics. In the height of the Terror, addressing one of the most hysterical parliaments the world has ever seen, Hamar declared that a quality essential in all who would take part in the government is imperturbable equanimity. Then he went on to inquire whether a woman's appearance in public is compatible with her good fame. Women, he contended, can best serve their country by influencing their husbands and teaching their children to love liberty. That Hamar was preaching to the converted was obvious. After a brief discussion, the resolution that clubs and societies of women, of whatever kind, are prohibited, was put and carried with only one dissentient voice, that of Charlier. He was an obscure Jacobin of whom little is known. He based his objection on the argument that as women were human beings they ought not to be denied the right to meet together peaceably. Not a very fortunate line of argument, considering the occurrences of the previous day. Bessire rejoined that Charlier did not seem to understand the question then before the House. Then, forsaking Hamar's broad line of reasoning, Bessire maintained that the question was not one of principle so much as of expediency. Whether or no these women's societies were dangerous. They had been proved to be dangerous. Therefore away with principles. It was this argument of inexpediency that was used by M. Clemenceau, when a woman suffragist deputation waited upon him in 1919. I grant, he replied, that every argument for giving votes to men may be used for giving votes to women. But we dare not give women votes in France, for fear, he added, of increasing the power of the Church. The women of the Revolution did not submit to their defeat without a protest. Denied access to the Convention on the 28th of November, a large company of them appeared at the Council of the Commune. Thence, too, they were expelled after having been treated to an anti-feminist diatribe by Anaxagoras Chaumette. Chaumette declared that the place in which the people's magistrates deliberate should be closed to all who insult the nation. No, cried another member, who realized that the women were intended. The law allows them to enter. Read the law, retorted Chaumette. The law decrees that morals shall be respected. Here I find them violated. Since when were women allowed to abjure their sex? Then, in words which might have been Michelet's, this ex-priest fell to the usual anti-feminist tactics for the so-called exaltation of women as the divinity of the domestic sanctuary. How could women be so foolish as to be discontented with a kingdom in which legislators and magistrates are at their feet? "Your despotism," he cried, "is the only despotism we cannot destroy, since it is founded on love and consequently on human nature. In the name of human nature stay as you are. Remember that haughty wife of a stupid and perfidious husband, that Roland who thought herself able to govern the Republic and endangered its fall. Remember that virago, that woman man, the impudent Olympe de Gouges, who tried to meddle in politics and who committed crimes. All these immoral creatures have been annihilated by the arm of the law. And do you wish to imitate them? Under the monarchy, women were everything because men were nothing. Only in the reign of Charles VII. Were Joans of Arc necessary." Chaumet's resolution that women should henceforth be excluded from the Commune's deliberations was carried. Claire Lacombe had not figured among the women whom Chaumette had denounced by name, because he had only mentioned those who were dead. But Lacombe, though alive in the flesh, was dead politically. Her political reputation could not survive the events of the 28th of October. So she now returned to her original profession. Early in 1794 she was about to leave Paris for Dunkirk to keep a theatrical engagement, when she was arrested on the charge of being connected with the Socialist enemies of the government. The Socialist leader Jacques Roux had already been in prison several months. Leclerc was arrested about the same time as Lacombe. He had by this time married Pauline Léon, who had been Lacombe's predecessor as president of the Republican Revolutionary Club. Lacombe's imprisonment, first in one jail, then another, lasted 17 months. For a while she was at the Luxembourg. There, carefully dressed and charming as ever, she turned an honest penny by selling candles to her fellow prisoners. Meanwhile her women followers, of whom she always had a devoted band, were leaving no stone unturned in their endeavors to procure her liberty. At length, in the autumn of 1795, they succeeded. The order for her release, signed by the Comité de Sûreté Générale and dated "Le Premier Fructidor," is the latest document and the latest information concerning this remarkable woman that has as yet been discovered. The women's party went down with the wreck of the Republican Revolutionary Club. The women's movement had resulted in complete failure. In face of the enormous prejudices against women's direct influence in politics, strengthened by the unfortunate influence of Marie Antoinette, in face of the lack of education and experience of the leading women, it had been doomed to failure from the outset. And latterly, had anything further been necessary to render its defeat inevitable, the final cause had been supplied by the alliance between feminists and the Socialists who were the sworn foes of the party in power. The feminism of the Revolution, as we have seen, was the first combined attempt to win political enfranchisement made by French women, indeed in modern history by the women of any country. This great pioneer movement could hardly have been inaugurated at a more unfavorable time. To pilot any movement past the shoals, the quicksands and the whirlpools of the tempestuous sea of the Revolution would have required genius of a particular order; and this the women leaders did not possess. Most of the difficulties against which they had to contend have already been noticed. One that has not been mentioned is the anti-feminism of prominent revolutionary women, notably of Madame Roland, Madame Robert, and Madame Tallien. Someone has said that there are two types of femininity, the pussyish kind and the tigerish kind. Feminists are of the latter type, anti-feminists of the former. Madame Roland, in her affectation of shrinking into the political background, is essentially pussyish. In this respect her whole career was a paradox. For here was a woman founding and dominating a party, for a time guiding the whole movement of the Revolution, and all the while insisting on the narrowest sex limitations. She was convinced, writes her friend Bosc, that woman must owe her celebrity entirely to the esteem she inspires by the exercise of her domestic virtues. Madame Roland, deeply immersed in politics, could yet at the same time write to Bancal, "I do not believe it to be in accordance with morals for women to come to the fore. They ought to exert a good influence, to foster and inflame every sentiment useful to la patrie, but they ought not to take any direct part in politics. They cannot come out into the open, agir ouvertement, until all Frenchmen deserve to be called free. Until then, our frivolity and our bad morals will render all that they do ridiculous." Madame Robert and Madame Tallien held the same opinions. "Women's domestic duties," wrote Madame Robert, "forbid her to exercise administrative functions. The companions of men ought not to be their rivals, said Madame Tallien. The only progressive measure either of them ever advocated were Madame Robert's proposal that health inspectors should be appointed in order to introduce some improvement into the miserable conditions prevailing in the hospitals, and Madame Roland's and Madame Tallien's demand for more educational advantages for women, but only that they might be fitter companions for men. All three of them were in this respect the Mrs. Humphrey Wards of their day. With the exception of short-lived newspapers like Bouche de Fer, the whole press of the day was anti-feminist, and one of the most influential revolutionary journals, Les Révolutions de Paris, under the direction of Prud'homme, for years carried on a vigorous anti-feminist campaign, mercilessly attacking all the feminist leaders and the women's clubs. Like other anti-feminists, the contributors to this newspaper were inconsistent, for while they maintained that woman has no concern whatever with anything outside the walls of her home, they called on women to assemble round the altar of La Patrie, there to swear that they would never marry an aristocrat, that they would bear lighted torches into the Tuileries Palace, and that they would redouble their ardor when the country was invaded. Did women then gain nothing at all from the Revolution? Olympe would not allow that they had benefited in any way whatever. But she was wrong. The Revolution had conferred on women two new social rights, the right to divorce, and the right to equality of inheritance. Revolutionary women, as we have seen, did not hesitate to exercise this right to divorce. Husbands, too, in considerable numbers availed themselves of it; and we have already mentioned the club for divorced women, Les Dames en État de Divorce. Like certain clubs of the present day, it was a blend of the club proper and the pension. Among its advertised attractions were a piano, a harp, and a harpsichord. It owed its existence to La Citoyenne Neveu, and its quarters were the mansion then known as l'Hôtel de Soubise, in which the National Archives are now kept. One of the famous divorces of the Revolution was that of the actor Talma and his wife Julie. Julie was wealthy as well as brilliant. Her house in la Rue de Chantraine was stored full of priceless treasures, many of which served Talma as theatrical properties. Madame Talma had been a great inspiration to her husband in his profession. But she was 7 years older than he. She had been his mistress before their marriage, and after a while he tired of her. Candid friends told Julie of his unfaithfulness. She sued for a divorce, sold her charming hotel to General Bonaparte just home from Egypt, and went to live with her friend Madame de Condorcet in la Rue de Matignon. She wrote an account of the divorce proceedings to Louise Fusy. We, Monsieur and Madame Talma, drove to the municipal offices in the same carriage. On the way we talked of all manner of subjects, like people taking a drive in the country. My husband gave me his hand as I alighted. We sat side by side, and we signed our names as if it had been the most ordinary contract. When it was done he escorted me to my carriage. "I trust," said I, "that you will not entirely deprive me of your society. You will come and see me sometimes, won't you?" "Certainly," he replied, rather embarrassed, but evidently pleased. In spite of all my efforts to control myself, I was pale and my voice trembled with emotion. I went home and gave myself up to my grief. Pity me, for I am very unhappy. Talma kept his promise. He often visited his former wife, and, says her friend Louise, his presence was always a consolation. In many other cases divorce did not involve the cessation of friendly relations between those who had once been married. More than one woman who had divorced her husband risked her life to save his. As time went on, divorces grew more and more common. They were granted for insanity, desertion for 2 years at least, emigration abroad in some cases, notorious immoral life, and incompatibility of temper. After the Restoration, Louis XVIII's government abolished divorce, and it was not reinstituted until Naquet's law in 1884. The second benefit the Revolution conferred on woman, the inheritance law, is in force to day. The statute which forbids a father totally to disinherit his children provides that he shall distribute his possessions equally among his male and female offspring. The far-reaching results of this measure in giving a certain economic independence to the women of France can with difficulty be exaggerated. Indirectly it has affected the question of women's suffrage, for it is this measure of economic independence that blinds many French women to the importance of political enfranchisement. Politically, women at the close of the Revolution were worse off than at the beginning. In none of its aims had the Revolution failed more signally than in the establishment of equality. It was essentially a middle class movement, and as such it had abolished but a few of the inequalities between classes. Inequality between the sexes, despite the two reforms we have mentioned, it left more strongly accentuated than it had ever been; for relations between men and women, which before the Revolution had been regulated by vague custom, were now clearly defined by law and generally to the disadvantage of the woman. The most notable instance is that of the franchise. In 1789, as we have said, women were admitted to the outer court of citizenship by reason of a very limited property qualification; but the property vote of 1789 was swept away with other vestiges of the feudalism of which it was a relic; and the Revolution left French women, as they have remained ever since, without votes for any governing body. End of Chapter 10. End of Women of the French Revolution, by Winifred Stevens. Recorded by Celine Major.